Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, Cyrus and Trisden raced across the land far to the north, well beyond the Western Expanse. As they continue on into Edaran country, their destination looms, where Cyrus will find allies of the Moondogs waiting to help him. Get ready for the next episode right now. Chapter 6. The Lightfoot Waltz. Cyrus. The 5th day of winter. Late evening. Trisden had howled, not nearly with the same force as Erathime back then, but closer to Erathime's roar than to a whisper. And because of that, the power of it had nearly knocked me off of my feet. Now why in the flaming hell do you think he did that? C's words were like a faint buzzing in the back of my head as I tried to regain my balance, stumbling against a thicket of trees and slumping into the brush. Trisden, why? He flicked his head back to me, but instead of responding, he simply stepped to the center of the clearing, set his teeth, and growled. All of the fur along his spine was standing up. He was ready for something. Trisden had slept through most of the morning and the rest of the day, leaving me alone to my own devices to roam. But after a tour of most of the valley came and went, I'd settled on a warm rock in the sun, and tried to reach out for that golden light that had started to swell within me at the Star Lake. I still had no real idea of what exactly that golden light meant, for either the forest or myself, and I didn't really know what I was supposed to do with the gold light, but it had been familiar, that was for sure. Sitting there in the valley and reaching out, I could feel some trace of gold swirling around me, but it was nothing compared to the Star Lake. Instead, it was just little wisps, sort of as hard to grasp and quantify as the idea of, sunlight. And no amount of coaching or cajoling from C, and also no amount of desperate frustration at the power that the Fire of the World's Ending had over me, made any difference. I didn't have a gift, at least nothing that I could control, and eventually I just let those wisps lie, and focused on listening, which was a skill I could wrap my head around. My senses, and particularly my sixth sense, that weird energy one, had continued to sharpen. And now, if I calmed my mind, breathed deep, and focused, I could see the world in more beautiful color, sense it all in more vivid detail than I had ever known before. The longer I looked at even a single tree leaf, the more I could see, because what had seemed to be just one color would fracture into 10 shades, then 100, then 1,000, creating an endless spectrum of life and energy and color, glowing all in that single spot. The longer I listened to the small creek running by, the more it broke into the sway of 1,000 different currents, of countless drops of water splashing and swirling, curving and crashing and breaking, binding together and splitting apart into spray. On the breeze, I smelled the kaleidoscopic scents of fields of flowers, the richness of the earth, the wisps of creatures that dwelled just out of sight, and a colorful tapestry of millions of other sensations that I couldn't even put a name to. And so on and so forth. As C put it, I had nothing even close to magical power, but I could get high on life whenever I wanted. So I guess I had that going for me. It was only when I heard a growl and a shriek, followed by bloody crunching and tearing, that I realized Trisden had woken up. I returned to him uneasily, because I was really still unsure how much of great wolves were human and how much of them were wolves. And I wasn't too far off. When I returned to where I'd left him, he was in full wolf form, devouring a fresh kill of some four-legged animal, maybe a deer. I tried to stay out of sight and out of mind as he ate, figuring it was better to let him be. But before long, he noticed me and growled, nodding his blood-stained snout towards the carcass. It took a few moments, as well as an explanation to him that, no, I couldn't eat raw meat, before he gave me a wolf shrug and continued eating. It was only when he finished and returned to his human form that I was able to communicate that just because I couldn't eat raw meat didn't mean that I wasn't hungry. And with his booming laugh, he rolled his eyes and started roasting some of the leftover meat over a fire. He thought I was really lame for that, but I preferred being lame over food poisoning. He didn't necessarily agree. He spent most of the time poking fun at me, as long as the meat cooked, like somehow it was my fault I couldn't eat raw meat. And then between that, he spent all the time chatting away, joking about this thing and that, but mostly it was just hunting and mating. Now, with Trisden, it was all sort of good-natured, rough-around-the-edges fun, which I realized was just sort of how Trisden interacted with the world. But even his raunchiest jokes and boldest stories couldn't quite make me laugh or gasp in wonder. There was still something bothering me. As I looked out into the forest, where the sunset was sending golden light through the many-colored leaves, all changing with the seasons, the words of the fire of the world's ending resonated in my head. I was surrounded by people with strength, and I was helpless. I had been set down in a beautiful world, and all I had found was violence and death. Everywhere I looked, I saw abundance, but I couldn't even feed myself without the charity of others. Pathetic, weak, worthless, it just kept running over and over in my head. As the afternoon went on into the evening, and the shadows began to stretch long, Trisden once again took his wolf form. It was a process just as magnificent and astounding as it had been the first time I saw it. But he moved on quickly. With another grunt from him, I clambered up onto his back and nestled in among his shoulders. Then, with another jostle to get me in position and test my grip, we were off again. Trisden leapt up the slanted rocks, over the ridge surrounding our little valley, and out again across the hills, where he began to accelerate again. Before long, the salty air of the coast whipped past us as we flew across the landscape, towards the town on the coast where I would find my next shelter, under the guidance and protection of one of the Watchers for the Wild. Trisden had explained that between dirty jokes and poking fun at how weak my stomach was. Apparently, there were many Watchers for the Wild, spread out all across the Edaran continent, hiding among both Freelanders and the Edarans in high and low places, where they might pass information back to the Great Wolves and their allies. And when Trisden said they were hidden, he meant it. Each Watcher's identity was a closely guarded secret, known to so few that even Trisden didn't know all of them. After all, the people of the Wild often went to great lengths to avoid discovery. He told me that there were some in the Northlands, and he was pretty sure that there were plenty beyond the Great Wasteland, far out of Edara's reach. But the full extent and detail, all of the network of the Watchers, that was information only for the Eratheme, and the Eratheme's counterparts in each region of the world. I'd had more questions, of course. Actually, many more questions, like I always did, but when I'd started to probe further, Trisden had just shrugged and told me that it wasn't his forest and not his wolves. And then he'd launched into some story about a wolf who had 3 legs and apparently a really big penis. Come on, Cyrus, don't hate on the story of old Johnny Fourlegs. I swear, Trisden has given you material to last until next winter, hasn't he? Yeah. Here, let me work on my delivery of the one about the 2 female wolves that Trisden was sent. Yeah, that's enough for now, see. I tuned him out, helped along by the sound of the wind, and instead I just watched the landscape go by. I wasn't sure how much later, but as we were arcing along a ridgeline near the coast, I saw human civilization for the first time since I'd entered the forest. It was just the twinkling of little torches in towns hugging the coast. Then again with little cook fires, another little village at a valley's edge. They were gone in seconds, and we quickly returned to the mountainside passes and the rugged terrain. But they served as yet another reminder that we had left behind the untouched wilds. We raced further into the night, and above us the moon rose, bold and bright, waning now, but nearly full, surrounded by the shining lights of the stars all around us. I could only see them out of the corner of my eye, slumped as I was against Trisden's shoulders, but even half of the night sky was enough to see constellations of tiny points. The higher we climbed into the mountains, the clearer the skies were, until the starlight began to fracture like the sunlight had, and each little dot showed faint insinuations of color. In each tiny point, if I looked hard enough, I could see the afterimage of grand reds and purples and greens and oranges, coming down to earth from impossibly far away, all as Trisden raced on under the night sky. Eventually, though, the stars faded and the sky ahead of us grew gently brighter. Trisden veered west, slowing down from his hurricane sprint to more of a prancing stride. He was still faster than a horse, but I wouldn't certainly have died if I'd fallen off. Just probably. Eventually, I felt the wind slowly start to die again, and we trotted to a stop on a ridge, perching at its edge to look down at the city far below us. There, the dark waters of a great river ran across the land from far to the east, meeting the ocean at the mouth of an enormous bay. Around it, the land stretched out in a great curving arc, with mirrored settlements on each side. The bay itself was nearly symmetrical, especially from this far, but even the coastlines weren't the same, and that was where the similarities ended. To the north, lines of lights traced gentle rings, like someone had very carefully drawn the city onto the land. Meanwhile, to the south, the city looked like it had simply come to be and was nestled into the terrain. Both settlements were exceptionally beautiful in their own way, especially the southern city, where the contours of the land were traced by torchlight and the moonlight far above. But we didn't spend long gawking. Trisden set off again, heading down into the thickening woods to the south side of the city, in the shadow of the hills. As we descended from the ridge, the woods grew deeper, feeling somehow more voluminous than the space that they occupied. And soon, as we ran through deep valleys filled with trees as thick around as a house, the forest reached up and blocked the sky. It was like we had stumbled onto a little island of the Expanse, a stretch of deep woods and untouched ground hidden right on Edaran's doorstep. Raw forces of nature filled the air here, a stark contrast to the tame wilds that surrounded the little coastal settlements we've been running by. And it was somewhere deep in the heart of that primal forest that Trisden had howled out his great call, and we had begun to wait. Finally removing myself from the brush where Trisden had tossed me, I tried to catch my breath and get my bearings. My senses hadn't gone into a frenzy like they did when Edaran roared, and the woods around us laid quiet, but Trisden was tense. He had called someone, or something, and I didn't think he was entirely sure of the response he would get. Trisden was always joking, but in the few times I'd seen him get serious, I knew it was time to be serious. Without being asked, I headed back to conceal myself in the bushes. It might not help hide me from something that could get Trisden this on edge, but with a glance back, he actually gave me a curt nod and continued to face the woods. So he had dumped me here for a reason, not just to mess with me. Settling into the cover of the bushes, I knelt down, sat back on my feet, and began to listen again. Trisden was the loudest energy that I could pick up with my sixth sense, but his was totally different than everything around us. They were almost equally wild, and they were similar, sort of the way green isn't similar to red. But as I got more familiar with the world around me and sat and listened, I realized that it would really be impossible to mistake Trisden for a native creature here. The land around us was rugged, ever-changing, carved from wind and salt, a place where the land met the sea. Even so deep here in the forest, life was tinted with the shades of ocean, stone, and storms. On the other hand, Trisden was full of green, brown, earthen power, with a tinge of gold to him as well, which I picked up as the Star Lake's shining force tinging him in his energy. Now, that was an interesting thought. If even the heart of the Western Expanse wasn't pure green, was there anything in the world that would be? And if a tinge of gold was enough to make my eyes and hands glow, what would a bunch of gold energy do for me? And where could I even find that much gold? And what on earth was the gold energy? I was dragged from my thoughts by the hum of the forest around us. It was like the land had begun to breathe, and then it began to beat, like a heart, in an almost melodic resonance. Trisden tensed up even more, and with a low rumble deep in his chest, he started to emit power again. This power was even more strongly him now than it had been before, and as the land began to resonate, Trisden's power became increasingly contradictory to the melody around us. He wasn't trying to hide. He was intentionally announcing his presence. And then what happened as the next few moments turned into minutes was hard to describe, but I'll try. When I'd been deep in the den of the Moondogs, I'd noticed that sometimes, if you listened hard enough, you could notice the natural world humming to its own rhythm. Well, it seemed like all of the ancient forest around us was swelling up in a chorus at that point, swaying in time to one melody that proudly declared the identity of this place and indicated who reigned supreme here. That song was intimidating, and it made me shrink even further into my bush, but Trisden flared out his sort of, soul music in response. He was definitely in a similar key and cadence, but his song and that of the forest were distinctly different. Not quite complementary, not quite contradicting each other, but not quite competing either. They simply were, and they sort of merged together, still showing their unique traits on each side. I was so caught up in that biological battle of the bands that I barely noticed when my normal senses picked up something moving just on the other side of the clearing. Maybe it had gotten so close because it was indistinguishable from the song of the forest, but there was no mistaking as it stepped into the moonlight. To meet us had come another great wolf, trimmed with deep brown fur. And while it wasn't quite so tall as Trisden, it was brimming with power all the same. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edaran and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to Archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.